This is Daviana Hicks doing the midterm oral assignment. There have been many recent events that have affected research in organizational psychology. One being when Obama was elected into presidency, it showed that high levels can be achieved by anyone regardless of race, changing the dynamics of old organizational psychology, focusing more on equity and fairness in organizations. Along with that came the use of technology. So as it became easier to use technology and access email, the workplace became more flexible, and the ability to complete tasks and do job work can be completed via computer, internet, email, at home, not only at work, which then led to more flexibility in being able to go global. So companies started to expand, going global, shifting the dynamics of organizational psychology and the research that was being conducted. Was making things so research was about how to make organizations more innovative and kind of shedding a light on that the old organizational theories were culturally bound, and instead they become more broad, and so the need to conduct new research on how these studies were done and include the new theories, which is that, you know, there's a variety of people and a variety of things. So we need to make more research about these new innovative ways that can be that can expand past the United States, past certain cultures, past certain places, and be universal, which is kind of what the new modern organizational psychology and researchers focus on, is the day and now, which involves, technology and globalizing companies and things of that sort. An example of an event that really shifted organizational psychology and some of the research was 9/11. It shifted organizational psychology's research on figuring out, emergency policies. Many organizations didn't have very specific emergency policies prior to 9/11. It shed a light on the fact that without the emergency policies, when there is a crisis, you know, the organizations can collapse as a whole, and therefore conducting new studies on emergency policies and how efficient they can be and effective they are for organizations has become one of the newer, more modern um, focuses of organizational psychology. Uh, as far as the socialization process for graduate students in my current program, it's online, which kind of goes along with the idea of technology and the change and shift in that. So, with it being completely online, the organization socializes new graduate students by um, having them for every class, complete an introduction to introduce themselves not only to the teacher but to other classmates. They have an open discussion board for questions where, the whole community in Liberty University can ask questions and have discussions and daily comments to one another. So it kind of gives the community sense, even though it's online. A part of the master's program is completing statistics and scientific research and stuff like that on, organizational psychology and industrial psychology. And then they allow us to do an internship or an externship implementing those studies that we found into real life. So seeing how that the scientist practitioner approach is being used within the socialization of this university itself. One thing that is important is that for newcomers, it allows us to build a bond, build a community, and feel safe, although it's online, because a lot of times it can be intimidating doing things online. Um, it is successful in socializing newcomers because there are so many opportunities and abilities and people there to talk to as far as the online instructors, the academic tutors, everything is online and accessible via internet or phone. Um, this is great when it comes to the embeddedness for creating jobs, because now we as grad students have that ability to implement the skills and knowledge that we had from our research and our hands-on um, practice with that research into our jobs that we are going into. So now we have the knowledge of how to do that, which will better our ability to be able to do our jobs and allow us to know certain ways to socialize ourselves within a company, new questions to ask, things like that, and how to implement new ways of socialization into the organization in which we go to. Organizations can reduce and prevent work-family conflict in many different ways. It can reduce family conflict by implementing or creating policies and benefits for their employees, becoming more of a family-based organization. Um, in order to do that, policies could be like the sick time or the family involved policies that they have, how much time you're allowed off, and the benefits of you have this amount of days off if you work this amount of days. Um, and they could reduce it by implementing the social support, assuring that there's a strong bond and community between coworkers and especially supervising staff, because that really creates a bond or a conflict at work when supervisors uh, are seen as intimidating or don't have that relationship with those employees do not feel that they can come to them, which creates a greater conflict. So then when something comes up outside of work, they don't feel comfortable enough coming to their supervisor and letting them know that they're having these struggles and asking how they can come up with new ideas to make it work their job and their home life so they don't have to quit. Another thing that they could do to reduce work conflict is mentoring. So having older staff or staff members who've been there longer, mentoring the new staff, showing them, these are different ways to do things, could kind of eliminate the work family conflict as well, because then they have different ideas and they see what worked for other employees. And then whenever those employees have a question, whether they feel like they need to talk to a supervisor, they are now comfortable enough to go ask another employee who they have that relationship with before they go to the supervisor, just in case, there's not a great supervisor employee relationship. They have other options and a way to feel comfortable at work. So if I were to imagine being asked to develop perform assessment program for employee development, the techniques that I would use to adequately evaluate the employee performance would be part of Murphy's List, which is incorporating the performance dimensions, the enroll and extra role dimensions. So the enroll being the task-oriented behaviors and like how well they perform those major tasks, and then the extra roles are the extra tasks that they do outside of the basic roles that they have based on their job description, as well as the destructive and hazardous behaviors and how they use their downtime. So evaluating their job description and the roles, how well they follow those, the extra roles outside of the description, and how they're using their downtime, and as well as, if possible, how they are being safe and things of that matter. So if I were to assess a program for employee development, I would evaluate the employee's performance using the behavior anchor scale, which specifies the behavior and avoids subjectivity. So it's not a poor, good, or great scaling. It's a specific, like, does this task as needed, or, specifying the task and what it is that he's doing, and if that person is doing that well. So I would use the items from Murphy's List with a behaviorally anchored rating scale and see how that goes. But on top of that, I would not only observe them one time, but several times. Avoiding error can be done by having a outside person come and observe. So at times, when supervisors come and observe their employees, the employees aren't completely the way that they should be or are, are normally, and sometimes there are biases when being observed by, you know, a supervisor or something like that. So, in order to avoid those, the observation can be done more than once and by more than one person, and then comparing those observations to see how consistent they are, um, to kind of create more of a validity to the observation. But it is important to use that behaviorally anchored rating scale to avoid all subjectivity when it comes to um, um, evaluating that employee adequately, because it leaves less room for error, and the less error or the more error that can be um, you know done or lessened, like the less error that can be done in the assessing the job performance, the better the observation will actually be, and will allow the not only the supervisors to see how the employee is doing, but the employee can also use that information and see how they can improve where they're lacking based off of these performance dimensions. Um, Possible common organizational constraints are environment. One major organizational constraint is the environment, as well as the relationships in the environment and the resources. So, um, as far as environmental relationships and resources kind of fall under the tier of the environmental constraints. So, how relationships can lead to counterproductive behavior is uh, attributing the negative relationship to the absenteeism, lack of communication between supervising staff and employees, or employee-employee relations as well, which can attribute to the counterproductive behaviors. Resources is a big deal as far as organizational constraints, because when there are not enough resources for a person to do their job efficiently, then it leaves room for error. So when there are not enough resources or that relationship to where someone can go and ask another employee for help or ask their supervisor, then things come into place, such as using outside resources to figure things out. So surfing the web for answers to questions that you could have answered if you were to have the right resources or the right or a good relationship with those supervising staff. Not having the appropriate tools as well as far as resources goes. So lack of resources as far as tools in construction. If there aren't enough of the right tools, and you can use this metaphorically, that when you're lacking tools, you have to either create something to replace that tool, or you have to go without. And either way, the foundation of whatever you're building will not be done correctly because you're missing that one important tool. So, um, those counterproductive behaviors are attributed to those organizational constraints because employees feel that they don't have that relationship or those resources, or they're lacking X amount of things, which is contributed to their counterproductive behavior. They're not able to contribute productive behavior to the organization because of these constraints.